Thank you for staying, actually, and thank you for coming. Let's try to see how this goes. This is called Toolbox. This is the first time that we are doing this, so please be patient. We don't know what it's like, and you will help us out figure it out. With me are Nikolina Pristaš, a choreographer and a dancer, a member of the Bedko dancing collective from Zagreb, Matilda Amundsen Bergström. Almost. She's a professor of literature at the Göteborgu University and in the Department of Literature and Religion.
And History of Ideas.
And Matilda is also a literary historian. And next to her is Ahmed Refaat. Ahmed, I completely forgot your name after 5 days. Ahmed Refaat is a film programmer from Contemporary Image Collective from Cairo, and he's the selector of the film festival of the Review of Small Literatures, the festival that we are presenting this in. Toolbox is an idea of a friend of ours and partner from Sweden, Göran Dahlberg, editor of Glanta magazine, who couldn't be with us. But he politely sent a text to explain to us what a toolbox is, and Matilda will let us know what the toolbox is.
I will do my best, as long as there are no follow-up questions, because these are Göran's words, so just imagine me as a middle-aged man. So Göran is the editor of Glanta, which is an independent published house and a quarterly cultural journal in Sweden. They are now putting together a toolbox, he says, and now commences the text. A toolbox where writers, scholars, and artists will be invited to present concepts that could be used to strengthen, rebuild, or completely dismantle societal structures. And as Mika said, the project has just started, so this is the very first installment, and we'll see how it goes. But why do we call it a toolbox? The inspiration comes from different sources. Number 1, a general description of language by Ludwig Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations, published in 1953, and I quote, "Think of the tools in a toolbox. There's a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects." End quote. Number 2, a definition. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's definition of what philosophy is, published in Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? What is philosophy? In 1991. And I quote again. "Philosophy is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts." End of quote. Number 3, a question by Audre Lorde, published in 1984. Quote, "Will the master's tool dismantle the master's house?" End of quote. This is a question that could be rephrased in many ways, like, is it better or more effective to work from within or from the outside? And is there really an outside position today? Is a reformistic approach more effective than a revolutionary? Some will argue that it's perfectly possible to make use of the master's tools, and they will do so. Some will argue that it's not possible, and they will therefore invent new tools. Someone would say that it's possible to redefine old tools in new ways, and others would say that it is not possible. Lorde's answer to her own question is a clear no. But one example of those who says yes is Michael Hart and Antoni Negri. In Empire, published in 2000, they use the motto from a song by Ani DiFranco, and I quote, "Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right." End of quote. But why now? Why do we need a toolbox at this moment in time? Audre Lorde's question was raised in another time and in another context. In New York in 1978, she was the only Black lesbian feminist invited to a feminist conference. That experience gave birth to the aforementioned essay, where she asks herself, quote, What does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruit of that same patriarchy? She's very skeptical when she continues, quote, "They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." End of quote. But even though Lord is very clear that we cannot use the old tools, one could perhaps also ask oneself another question. Is it possible to use Lord's question to make better use of our tools, old or new? If so, we always need a new toolbox. Every time needs a new toolbox. So I hope that was clarifying for everyone.
Or confusing, we'll see now. So the idea is that Nikolina, Matilda, and Ahmed present what they see as tools in short presentations of 5 to 7 minutes, and then we discuss. So I have some questions down, but the idea of the format is also that we all involve into discussion at any point in time when you feel like it, with a question, with a comment, with an answer. So who will begin, Nikolina?
Super. Okay. So I'll just read what I wrote to you, and maybe to explain a little bit. So I'll start first with the use of the tool. How can it be used to fix the society? So I wrote this. In times when it seems that we are facing an inevitable catastrophe, that human beings do not have a future on Earth anymore, I feel that one important gesture against despair and depression, at least my own, would be to free my imagination from the suffocating and immunizing effects produced by these catastrophic visions and narratives. Although the tool I'm proposing for this discussion is not a solution, maybe it's not really a tool at all, it is a first step which shifts my attention towards a new understanding of my own modes of creating and maybe of living. So for this tonight, I chose to speak about the practicing of the impossible. This is how I would call the tool that I propose to talk about tonight. The description of the tool, what it is, I put writing scores for impossible acts in impossible times. In terms of what I do, who I am as an artist, it would be like the concept would be the choreographic impossible. So how to think proceeding choreographically or composing of the body in dance through thinking about impossible body, impossible space for that body, impossible effects that this body produces, or impossible accords this body kind of creates with environment. Genealogy of the tool, I can speak about this in more precise ways if it's going to be necessary later on. Genealogy of the tool is not a new tool. It's actually an old idea proposed by composer John Cage when he was writing Freeman's Etudes. So Freeman Etudes were a very difficult piece of music, or are a very difficult piece of music that took almost 8-9 years to be made. And it's an interesting also process and the time, these 8 years that passed from the beginning until the composition was finished. Then it was followed and appropriated, this is important to say, appropriated by Chicago-based performance group The Goat Island in their performance The Sea and the Poison, which was made in 1996. And then again appropriated by a collective that I'm working with. The thing to say is that the way John Cage was working with the idea of the impossible is different than the way Goat Island worked with the idea of the impossible, and different from the way we kind of appropriate the idea, because we all have different fields of impossibilities that we can work with. So this, I think it's important to say, and if you want me, I can explain a bit more about this later on. In this, having this in mind, I will just kind of quote John Cage's sentence or kind of statement that he made when he was making these Freeman Etudes, because this is something that caught our attention, and this is why we Goat Island, and we kind of got hooked to the idea of the impossible, practicing of the impossible. So Cage said, these are intentionally as difficult as I can make them, because I think we are now surrounded by very serious problems in society, and we tend to think that the situation is hopeless and that it's just impossible to do something that will make everything turn out properly. So I think that this music, which is almost impossible, gives an instance of the practicality of the impossible. The difficulties of the pre-manitudes are thus not a perverse torture for the violinist or the composer, nor are they just an opportunity for showing off. They are a kind of fable about the ability to do the impossible. So, in a sense, when I think about making art, it's very easy after 20 years of experience. It's kind of easy and simple to make art by following the procedures or your own know-how, so that you just kind of rely on what you know in order to be able to make a new work of art. But it's interesting, and it can be a transformative experience if you try to tackle problems and ideas which put you in a situation of proceeding without inertia, of already the know-how, and by putting a little bit more extra effort in terms of how you go step in, step out from the procedure, in the process itself, and that the process of making work and performing a work turn into a kind of non-stop continual question-making in the pursuit of the impossible, rather than coming to a point and then repeating that point over and over. So this would be a kind of my proposition to start, okay?
Thank you, Nikolina. You can pass the mic to Matilda, or no, I will pass the mic here.
But if you want to comment.
No,
So I can start from the place that I work in as a small scale context, and then I would just give a reference of a larger context where this institution is working, and then I would say the two that can I start from?
Yes.
Okay. So I work in an art institution in Cairo. It's contemporary art institutions, which means it has some sort of a legacy of working in elitist circles, if you want to say. And then that's the legacy that when I started working there, that the legacy that this institution carried, as well as most of the other institutions that are tied with the concept of contemporary art. So that's what I work in, and then it changed a bit 5 years ago when we decided to do some of the stuff. We curated some projects that intentionally deals with their surroundings. So we wanted to have an intersection with the social political context, and we wanted to bring somehow those different people who are working on similar stuff, whether they're human rights, whether they're in academia, whether they're in different forms of art, literature, whether it's literature, music, those new media stuff and video art and stuff like that. So when we started to do that, we of course resorted to what we know most, which is exhibitions. So we started working on exhibitions, and we started putting with those exhibitions some of the stuff that you can call time-based as this event. So it entails some of people coming together and discussing something, someone proposing an idea and then people discussing it, a screening, and then people discuss what they saw. And then when we realized, after doing some of those events, that we actually get something very interesting that doesn't happen with exhibitions a lot, which is people discussing stuff that goes way wider than the artworks or the proposed scope by the legacy of contemporary art. So about the wider context, I have a quick quote that I will read, and it's from a publication that we did at CIC. So that's a quote from a text in this publication. The text is called "Delirium in the Streets, the Weary." So it's by Basma Abdelaziz. The quote goes, "We've heard a lot about bound tongues and imprisoned bodies. The chorus is louder at times, and at others it fades away, held in check by consequences." So I have this quote because I think it gives you an impression about, the larger context. I have another quote about discussions in an art institution as such. This is not by Basma Abdelaziz, this is by me and Andrea Tal, the people who work at CIC. "One of the interesting things about talking in the presence of artworks is that it allows us to talk in the presence of a form, a medium, that tries to represent our relationship to our surroundings. As abstract and vague as that statement might be, by carving out a space for talking around artworks, we hope to talk about social and political issues around us in a way that includes the possibility to rethink and redefine our relationship to that reality." So I think that's what we experienced, and then the whole curatorial approach lean towards those choices. So we make more time-based events, and we choose artwork based on that criteria more and more, how people will come together and practice that sort of assembly, small-scale assembly, and discuss. Now that proposes some other, about the genealogy question. That comes from different genealogies because we come from different places as people. So the artistic director, I would say she comes from Switzerland. She is more, she used to work in a space that is more discussions around migrants' rights and stuff like that. So that her space where the people, everyone that is not super welcomed in the city is welcomed, and they or curate for them and make content for them, and it becomes a space for everyone to talk. I come more from the cine club or film clubs kind of practices, which people come to, they're usually introduced to something and then they watch it and then it's being discussed. So those are different genealogies that come together, and I think they shape how those discussions are made. And also we started to be aware of that different scales about makes different discussions. So in a situation such as this one, which is super relevant to what I'm talking about, you can imagine that you bring so many things into a discussion that you cannot bring to a more public one. So ideas are mixed with feelings. Feelings are also mixed with ambition and other kind of bad feelings that are floating around. So you can have some sort, what I can claim, it's a multi-layered discussion that can bring so many ideas from different disciplines, but also different levels of engagement. So you have the intellectual and the conceptual, but you have also something emotional happening, especially if the artwork proposes the ground. So this is what I would say I can...
That was the name of the tool.
it's okay, I have a shiny name. Time-based events, so something like that. It's mainly people coming together, and it's announced from, for example, 7 to 9 or 6 to 8, and they know that they're going to be a discussion. They will be part of a collective discussion. They will have to listen to people talking, being active themselves, but this is basically what they're coming from.
Thank you, Matilda.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I was terrified when Göran, who's not here to answer for this now, asked me to partake in this because, as Mika said, I am a literary historian and I don't really think of myself as someone who uses theory a lot, work with concepts a lot. But of course we all do because we all live in a world of concepts. But Göran just asked me to dig a bit where I stood, and so I did. So I'm going to talk about a really old concept that is very central in a research project that I'm working on. And it's going to be really interesting to speak about this here because I think that my thoughts about it are very firmly rooted in a Swedish, very liberal and very secular context. So we'll see what you think. But the concept is called temperance. And I wrote a little text about it, and here we go. So Pope Gregory I lived during what is called the late antique Little Ice Age, during the 6th and 7th centuries AD. And from an environmental perspective, his days were some of the most troubled in European history. Temperatures dropped a lot. In the year 536, for example, authors spoke of a year without summer, causing famines and creating ideal conditions for plagues. And in recent years, researchers have actually claimed that these environmental catastrophes contributed very significantly to the fall of the Roman Empire. But Gregory himself, he was convinced that the whole world was ending. And we can actually see some interesting similarities in his writings and some of the writings about climate change today. But Gregory thought that these fatal changes in the climate was all God's punishment for human excess. And according to him, there was only one way to remedy this situation. Man must relearn temperance. And now, since I am a literary historian, I tend to look to the past when trying to think about the future, but I really do feel that in quite a few interesting ways, Gregory and I live in similar times, especially with regards to the feeling of helplessness in the face of a natural world that is changing with potentially catastrophic consequences. But at first consideration, this answer that seemed so clear to Gregory, temperance, or with a slightly less archaic sounding word, moderation, seemed really outlandish to me. But the strangeness of the term sparked my interest and got me thinking. Could temperance be revived? Could it be a useful concept in a critical discussion about human involvement in climate change? And could temperance, that instinctively feels impossibly conservative and conformist, be part of the revolutionary thought and action that these dire warming times require? And temperance has a really, really long history. For about 2,000 years, it was one of the principal virtues in the ethical systems of ancient, medieval, and early modern Europe. And as I see it, the system of virtues was a sort of code of conduct designed by philosophers and politicians, Greeks and Romans mostly, to make people live well together. And it was really a practice, a doing more than a being, and something that each person performed for the good of others, and an extension, of course, for the good of the state or the country or the faith. And this code of conduct varied according to your gender, class, and age. And in short, I guess you could call it a rule book for fitting in, really, or staying in your place. But importantly, it was also a guide to living well and to take responsibility of what your being in the world meant for others. And temperance was at the center of this ethical system. And the concept is sometimes described as avoiding excess and extremes, practicing self-restraint in relation to bodily pleasures, especially food and alcohol. But as I see it, temperance is a much more complex ethical concept than that. And moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has explained temperance as the choice not to use power when one could choose to do so. And in connection to that, I tend to think of temperance as the active practice of choosing to not have it all, of acknowledging that there are consequences of fulfilling our desires. That means that having what we want can't always be justified. And importantly, I see temperance as a practice of empathy, solidarity, and responsibility. A self-restraint directed towards someone else and performed for someone else. So in that way, a lot of popular practices of self-restraint, such as dieting, for example, isn't really temperance because it's not performed for someone else necessarily. And you could also argue that enforced moderation, such as bans on smoking that we had recently in Sweden, is not really temperance either, because as all virtues, temperance is as much the choosing to do something as the actual act itself. And very, very briefly, the history of temperance can be drawn from Plato's dialogue, Charmides, and Aristotle's ethical handbook, Nicomachean Ethics, by Cicero's conduct books for the Roman republics, to Thomas of Aquinas' writings on Christian ethics. So as you can tell, this is really right in the middle of Western philosophy and Western ethics. And in his book After Virtue, MacIntyre claims that temperance, along with the other virtues, have their last champion in Jane Austen. And I love that because I really love Jane Austen. But more generally, of course, temperance disappears in the early 19th century because there's simply no place for it in a capitalist, individualist consumer society. And in the 19th century, weirdly, temperance instead becomes a lead word for the North American sobriety movement, non-drinking movement. And I think that might be one of the reasons why it feels like a really dull term today. But instinctively, of course, a lot of the things that temperance evokes, fitting in, avoiding excess, moderation, self-restraint, they don't actually feel super sexy or super inspiring. And I think that might be why, even though virtue ethics has gotten quite a lot of attention recently, temperance has still not really been discussed in relation to our times. So why revive it? I guess we can talk more about that together later, but I just want to say quickly that with the climate emergency upon us, we have to try to understand why we don't stop abusing the world that we live in. Why do we keep living as though we had resources which we know we don't have? There's something in our values and in our worldviews that makes us hesitant to act to slow down climate change. What is that? And those are the kind of questions that I feel we need to get at if anything is ever to change. And I hope that maybe the idea of temperance might prove useful here. And that it could be a productive concept when trying to formulate a new sort of ethical model, which I'm convinced is required. And I think that's already being practiced today in the downshifting movement, for example, but we haven't really found a language for it or a theoretical perspective. And being sure as I am that it'll be really hard to solve the climate crisis from within a capitalist consumer society, I also wonder if maybe an ethical system that is already proved incompatible with the capitalist worldview might provide an opening in that worldview, provide a sort of Verfremdungseffect that can shock us into new trains of thoughts, without wanting us to turn back time, of course, and adopt the often problematic idea of temperance wholesale. So I'm really interested in that, how we can reuse or recycle old concepts that feel outdated to think in ways that we don't think about now.
Well, thank you all three, and now we will talk. I would go back to, and I would ask, I'm asking the questions, so please join in, and I'm asking, I'm not directing questions. I'm not directing questions at anybody, so I won't kind of call your names. But I was thinking maybe we could start with going back to the original question: can the master's house be, can it be dismantled by the master's tools? What are your thoughts on that? Because you, Ahmed and Matilda, you are using the old tools in a new way, and with Nikolina, it isn't an old tool. And so, what do you think if these tools that you propose, whether they could be used to fix the society, as we put it in the, or and if so, in what way?
I'll start then. Throw myself out there. Well, I used the really old.
Yeah, I'm just. If you don't think the question is relevant at all or useful, maybe we should just skip it. Just yeah, if you think that it's not relevant, say.
I think it's a very relevant and therefore very difficult question to try to answer. But for me, like I said, I tend to think of concepts as little pathways in my head. And so like the ones that are very well established, you just walk and you don't really like see what's going on. You just like move from A to B in your head or in your feelings or whatever it is. And I think there's danger in that because you automatically make assumptions. So I think that it's really important to try to shock your thought into taking other pathways or going in other directions. And I think that new concepts are very useful for doing that, but it doesn't necessarily mean new combinations of letters. I mean, words can become concepts, and old ones can be revived and things like that. So I think it's more complex than just like a yes or no thing. But I think there's a value to just swapping a letter or changing a language or whatever it is, just because it wakes us up.
Okay, maybe just to respond to this question about the master's house, like it really depends what is in the house and what are the tools somehow. Like when it comes to this, what I proposed, the idea, like for example, John Cage composes in a way to use this etching method. He randomly chooses a piece, like from the star atlas, he puts a point on the paper and this is the first note. And then by etching method and in collaboration with the violinist, decides upon every other note. So every note is a result of 100 different chance procedures. And it's an impossible thing to compose because there are no laws of rhythm, harmony, meter, whatever is a kind of logic of composition of music. And it only has this logic of kind of trying to proceed with the most impossible thing to do next, in the next step, for every note. Now, to think about in movement in such a way, it's completely useless. Because like, it would render, it would completely immobilize movement, or it's a different logic of the instrument, so to speak, with which, or the tool with which is, I mean, not the tool, but to what it is applied, so it doesn't make sense. But what makes sense is try to find another way to deal with the impossible when it comes to composition of the movement, because it, from my perspective, it tackles the way, the idea about what I can imagine my body to become in dance. And in this respect, we basically ignored Cage's procedure and tried to kind of, but respected or wanted to repeat the gesture, or trying to apply the gesture to what makes sense for us in the things that we were doing.
Just to quickly respond to that, I think that's really great, and I love the Wittgenstein quote that Jaron had in his text. I really think tools are tools; they're meant to be used. So if an old one works, then it's a good tool, and if it doesn't, it's not. They're really like working concepts, and I think it really depends on what you're trying to do.
And Nikolina brought up this issue now of translating a concept from one field into another. So now, after listening to all your presentations, and you are coming from different disciplines, do you think, and how do you think you could translate the concepts that the other presented into your own field? I mean, there are some obvious for me, there are some obvious answers, but I think that what you explained about the translation from music into movement, it's really the idea of translating or applying a concept from one sphere into another. So what do you think about this application of your own tools or the tools that the other one presented?
And just like I have a quick answer to the thing about inventing or creating new tools, and I think it was in the introductory text by Jaren, something about the positionality, the where can you be if not inside? I mean, there is some sort of an impossibility, which resonates with what you're saying. It's a body, and you have a set of restrictions, and that set of restrictions is embodied in your case because you work with dancing and movement, and in some cases it's structure. It cannot be avoided in a way. So I think whatever is going to be developed is going to be developed from there, at least as a position. And but I've seen, because I'm not an artist, I'm actually a cultural worker, and I work as a curator, and I work with art, not doing art. I think that I see some of the artworks that I see are actually, even if they're not engaged conceptually with the notion of impossible or new or having something that is not there yet, I think that I see from time to time. I think artists are more engaged with the question, even if they're not explicitly engaged with the conceptual question in itself. So what I've seen artworks closer to new tools, but in terms of cultural work, I wouldn't say I lean towards the other end of what can we do with the available tools, especially that I don't know where is the benchmark that this becomes a new tool. I mean, it's a tool that have been developed and reshaped more than 1,000 times. It's super time-based. It's about the specific moments and those specific bodies. So sometimes, of course, I cannot say anything except it's new. It's the first time that I see this output, and that happened. If I want to talk about the discussions, the thing that I talked about.
No, just like with oldness and newness again, getting back to that. But also thinking another interesting aspect that you just brought attention to now is also like when is a concept new, and the possibility of having a new concept in some context or for some people. Because like all concepts have a history, it's impossible for us to step out of that history. I also thought about how I could use your concepts and steal them. No, but I love the idea of the time-based event. Is that what you said? Yeah, time-based event. Yeah, it's a good word.
Come up with the concept, bro.
It's a really good word.
I would call it discussion side.
But I like that term. And I got really inspired straight away because I struggle a lot. I work with very old literature. And with the literature that I work with, a written text is always an act. It's never an object. And it's never really an expression. It's very action-based all the time. And it's hard to convey that sometimes in a world like ours, where we tend to think about text as things and also quite personal, like we read them and we think about it as something that is expressed by someone. And I was thinking straight away that it would be very interesting to talk about written texts as also time-based events, because I think that is quite close to how they were actually conceived, to be a sort of discussion in a specific setting. So just a quick comment on that, it's really interesting.
But now you brought us to the, we discussed earlier this dilemma between the concept and the practice. So we are, I have a feeling that we are kind of talking about both in the same way, but what does it depend on? When is it the concept and when is it the practice? Or are they the same? What are your thoughts on that? Like, now you're talking about the text being an act and not a passive object of, I don't know, study. So can you, from your practice or from your concepts, delineate, or is there any delineation between the concept and the practice? Because the concepts are, if they are abstract, how can we use them? And if they are concrete or practical, how can we use them then?
I can start. Okay, like when it comes to practicing the possible, this is like a great example because like it's a concept that Cage proposes in a moment, a certain moment where he lives, when he lives, and then it becomes another practice when it comes to go to dialogue, and it becomes another practice when it comes to us. When it comes to relationship, concept and practice, for example, in the dancing, like okay, you have an idea or specific like okay a concept, and you want to like, and the beauty about working with concepts is like keeps you on track around the concept, so you can keep producing different practices or different ways how to engage practically with the concept. So for example, this first level was trying to engage with the impossible on the level of composing body, but the next question is how to maybe rethink this through dialogue or rethink this in relationship to some other concept or in some other context in my life. What does it mean actually in my daily living? Like, you know, there is something about, I was petrified when I started reading about climate change, really, and for a very long time I could not bring myself to a point of kind of having any optimism. I read The Guardian non-stop, so I stopped now. But like for example, so I decide, okay, no more car for you, or only when you really need the car. But then this means that I go by bike 3 times a day. When my father was in the hospital, I went 3 times a day to Rebro, to another part of the city, 45 minutes ride, and then back, and then back again, and then back. And then my child doesn't see me all day because I'm kind of pushing my ecological agenda. So it's not only this, maybe I gave a radical example, but it has something to do with time and duration and how we live, in which kind of speed we actually live today, and how we adjust these things on a daily level. So how this becomes practice, you know, like it's really a question of friction. It's not okay, that's a simple solution, I'm just gonna go there. Also temperance, I think it's one of the most important things when we come to face climate change. That it's not about us not using some or trying to go not fossil fuels but more like electronic or, you know, like it's just not that, it's just like using less, eating less, buying less clothes, needing less because we don't need. So it's like, or for example, you know, like today, if you want to travel from Zagreb to Copenhagen, not by plane, it will take you 48 hours. So you just need to have the time to do that if you want to be ecologically conscious on one level, if you want to live this as a daily practice. And another is activism and of course change that comes from above, prescriptively through governments and everything. But you know, like thinking about how concepts work and how you translate them into a practice and back. Art is in a way a good practicing field. You know, it's like a playground. And it's much more hard to come to real life, but if you don't try, then then it's not possible. Then impossible is not even a category then, right? If this is not possible. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, of course. But we touched upon few things, and you all mentioned it in a certain way, and I jotted down collectivity. Because when we talk about the concepts, it's not something that we are, or whatever that is. We think about them in a collective setup. Temperance can be very individual thing, but it is in relation to somebody. Imagination is very individual thing, but it is in relation to somebody, and it's always somebody, someone. So I would like to hear your thoughts about around collectivity and how you're, especially Ahmed, what you're proposing is very collective idea, and you have a single piece of art, if I understood you correctly, but then you have a collective discussing what does it produce, and where does this concept lead us when we think about the wider society, beyond that group?
Maybe just a quick comment on concept versus practice. That what I try to do here by this presentation is something that is echoed, that I felt is echoed in that event, and by consequences in other events that happen, like in the institute institution I work with, or other culture institutions, which is in itself a process of trying to conceptualize something. So you conceptualize a practice, or you conceptualize something that you not per se, it's not per se outside of those walls a concept, but you bring it as a concept here. So just a quick note. So what I proposed is for sure a practice and not a concept. And from that position, what happens, I think, is that you meet something while you're practicing that activity of discussion, and then you find out that people have conceptualized it somehow and talked about it. So you meet that some people tend to feel more comfortable in a space than others. Some people talk more than others. Some people will reflect more violent ideas in spaces than others. So, and you find out that people actually talked about that, and how people move in a space, and how bodies feel in a space, and all those tensions that comes from lots of layers of power dynamics that actually is translated in a space. So then you follow a concept, and then you come back to your practice, and then you find another concept that your practice proposes, and then you see all of that. That's I think how this relation between concepts and practice is actually practice. Where they come from. What was the other question?
The question was, okay, maybe I don't need it. The question was about how you translate in a collectivity the practice or the concept that you use in a wider collective, in a society, and not in a group of people.
I think this is...
What is the impact that you think it creates?
I think that, as I said, the most attractive thing in this idea for me is that what happens when that space opens, when representation is brought back to reality, and reality is not separated from representation. So that something happens, especially if it works. You know, I'm not saying it's a magical door. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it works, lots of times it does. But when it does work, that's the door that opens. And I think in that door, I can claim, although I cannot say that I imagine what you're actually talking about really well. You know, again, I'm not an artist. You know, I cannot say that I have this real relationship with the impossible. But I think the future becomes a bit bent with the past, and we're here, and we're talking about histories, but we're talking also in a moment of something has opened that we can discuss our relationship to what's happening inside in another way. I don't know if that answers the...
Yeah, just maybe to try to tie into that, I think, well, the idea of concepts, it's so interesting because it's so messy in so many ways. And I tend to think of concepts as metaphors, I guess, because I work with poetry. And it's such a fascinating thing to me that someone feels something, and the only way to take care of that feeling is to say that their heart is burning or something like that, which obviously it isn't. It's trying to create an image. And I guess that it has something to do with experiencing a world and feeling and experiencing a very strong need that other people to check, is my reality the same as yours? So we do things, we're practicing things, but we have this need to just connect, I guess, in that practice. And I think that's what metaphors do, and I also can think of concepts as that. It's a way to just try to connect or like draw lines between our individual experiences somehow.
And if to go further with that, if we have a toolbox which has tools, do we all agree on what each tool does? Like if you have a hammer, do we all agree that the hammer can be used for tearing down the walls or whatever? But I find that quite interesting, whether the concepts that we are talking about, and now you mentioned that we are talking about, do we all see them the same way? Should we? Is there a level at which they should be seen the same way in order to be used? Or we can all, my fear is that at this moment in time, we all tend to think what we want to think about the same things. So I see it from this side and you see it from that side, but we tend to disagree about everything. I'm now maybe exaggerating, but I don't think I'm exaggerating much, especially in this. So in a toolbox, do we all know what and how do we make us all understand what each concept does or each tool does and how it should be used? Does anybody have an answer, or in the audience?
I can start by trying to say a few words. Well, I think maybe again you could use the metaphor of concepts being like metaphors. Because with poetical metaphors, for them to work, there has to be some common idea of what they mean. If I say that my heart is burning and the person thinks that that means something completely different, it's not going to work as communication. And I guess in a way, the point of concepts is in part trying to communicate your experiences of what is happening. But as well, like at the same time, metaphors are infinitely open as well. And like how they resonate in you and what they make you want to do or think further on and associate to, that's very specific for you. So they're both sort of set and not set at the same time. And possibly that could have some similarities with concepts.
No, I wonder. Take the mic on this one.
I think what's interesting about that we have a common understanding of something is something that can be super conservative and super radical at the same time, because it means that some stuff of the super established stuff will never be renewed, and also it seems like we cannot communicate on some basic level, so that's the dystopic stuff, but it also means that maybe we also have the capacity, this collective mental capacity reflected in language, that we can maneuver some terrains that we do not actually have any fucking idea what we're doing, what we're talking about, or how this will go in a way. I would give an example by relationships, for example. Some people have started lately to maneuver terrains of emotions and setups and expressing that to each other between friends, lovers, and what's all in that mess in a way that is actually nobody have a clue, but we have some of the stuff that is just enough for us to, sail in the dark for a bit and see what can happen.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Nikolina was saying about imagining the impossible, and not only practicing the impossible, but also imagining the impossible. So when it comes to imagination, I have to ask her a question. Like when Joran and I were talking about this, about the toolbox and what we are actually what we want to fix with the tools and what is the house, and we quite often we mention the word democracy. That is kind of a common word. Everybody knows what democracy is, but we are at the time when we don't seem to have a consensus on what democracy is, but we also don't seem to have a consensus on whether we should have a consensus on what democracy is. And it doesn't mean that we have to have the same idea of democracy, but the basic understanding of it, we thought that would be useful. Like when you say democracy, that it can't be combined with illiberal democracy. what does it even mean? And we now have the illiberal democracy, the compound, the syntagm that 20 years ago would sound ridiculous. And so my question is that, like, it is also a new concept. Illiberal democracy is also a new concept. Or is it? Or is it not? I guess I'm asking the question, how do we how do we tell the difference between the uses of the tools that we have in the toolbox? It was in the beginning when you read the concept Jan sent, is that they can be used as a weapon and as a tool. So how do we have any questions or answers on this? How do we make a tool and not a weapon, or how do we turn it into a weapon when it has to be a weapon, and against whom? Does anybody? Did I just made it so complicated? I don't know.
It's just a hard question.
Yeah.
I think it's important to us, but it's.
Yeah, I don't know with you. You don't have to answer.
No,
I mean, it's not about answering.
No, but I agree. It's a really, really, really important but really hard question. I think also really hard to say anything general about if we try to stick with the idea that tools are things that you use.
But maybe it would be easier to start thinking from your own tool, like in this situation, just to be more concrete or precise. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely. See. So what was the question again now?
So the question was if you can apply your tool to what I asked about, how to differentiate it, whether it's tool or a weapon, when it should be a weapon, and who can use it and how, and do we have at least a common understanding of that?
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's really interesting in relation to temperance, because, well, there are many problems with that concept, I think, and one is that, like, virtue ethics is a lot about the individual as well. Like, it's an outward directed practice, but it has a lot to do with individual choices and choosing, and just like you were talking about, choosing to take your bike instead of. And I mean, I think in that way, it's quite problematic, because I think that the idea of choosing is quite problematic in the time that we live in, where we more and more turn into consumers instead of citizens, or whatever it was that we were. And so it's hard in that way, but then in other ways I think it responds to some pressing questions that we just need to start thinking about somehow. And I think maybe that's all you can really hope from a concept. Like, I don't think there are any flawless concepts or safe concepts in that way at all. I mean, like, a hammer can be used to put up a painting and to smash someone in the head. And I think necessarily the same goes for concepts. So it has to be situation bound at all times, I think.
So, contextual.
I would say that as a concept, it's super, for me, for where I live, it's super framed by a super specific context, which is in general very European concept of democracy, and it's also used as a weapon by those European institutions. Also, and not just as weapons to defy, not for a good cause or to actually fix some of the issues, but also to reproduce a set of, I would say, corrupted representation that doesn't lead to anything. And it's this, at the same time, you as a citizen, you see that the citizens of this continent are already in a fight with that concept, but that concept comes to your country as something that you need to be doing. And it's seriously bad on too many levels. It's bad on the actual level. for example, it increases the prices, it does inflation, it gives you more financial policies that will actually not very helpful to your economy. It's not super localized in any way, but they're forced and they're enforced. And that's on that level, but there's the other level, which is also the imaginative level, you know. So we need to end up with a parliament that look like the EU parliament in a way, and it's as if that will fix the problem. I'm not saying that there's no other histories that are helpful, that are coming from around here, that can be helpful if people have implemented them. But I'm saying it's a very bad concept in a way. If it's just conceptual and not tied very well, and in the context where I come from, have also another layer of localization and contextualization that needs to be happened. It's a colonial tool, you know.
And just to tie into that really quickly, I think that, concepts are an attempt to say what reality is like, right, in a way. And there will always, because reality is always horribly messy, there will always be a gap between what you say that reality is like and what reality is actually like, and experience for different people in different positions of power and so on. And there is so much power in that space between conceptualizing reality and reality that makes it a very complicated practice, I think.
Can you like maybe with temperance, with dialogue, I think it's much more complex. But just immediate response to temperance, this leads to maybe the idea you have reserves about the concepts, and I don't. When I hear temperance, for me this is like, yeah, that's the way to go. So for me, I see, like, for example, very simple temperance. If it were practiced on a state level in schools from beginning when we were kids, it would be a tool to make our lives less dependent on money, and it would be a weapons against consumerist society. So it's either way, it can't be bad. I don't see, because I think we went so much overboard with our excessive hate, love for things, money, and we kind of just shifted everything that makes us human into kind of circulation of goods somehow. And even if you don't want to do it, you are non-stop pressed. It's an effort, like for example, from the position of a parent, it's an effort to educate your kid in a kind of the other stream. It's an effort. It takes a lot of dialogue with anyway, and discipline. You know, to discipline yourself to stay on the same path somehow. So, anyway, this one.
And you are pushed by the forces.
You're pushed by. It's just the context is like this, because like another kid or like the family or whatever has different views, or come on, it's just a thing. It's a kid. Why don't you give it? So it's very simple in a daily communication. It creates a lot of problems when you want to explain to your child why she cannot get this toy. And you can buy it.
But at the same time, we are in a very Catholic country, so temperance means something very specific as well. And especially when we discuss that in the context of women's bodies, when we talk about that in the context of how the society perceives what is temperance, and then you get into this realm of normativity, where somebody decides what temperance is, and that's where we go back to the collective and
women
the society.
should decide, that's for sure.
Yeah, but that's the problem with concepts. They create reality, so they create norms. And I just thought it was quite interesting example in Sweden, which is maybe 5 or 6 years ago or something like that. A new concept became very popular in politics, and it's outsidership, utanförskap. So it's like a take on citizenship, but they changed the citizen part to outsidership. Used when talking about people who come from different countries, for example, or now more specifically, who don't really partake in society as these political parties that talk about this term want political society to be like. And that is such an interesting thing because 8 years ago there was no outsidership. You couldn't have an outsidership. And now you can. Now it is something real that exists in the world just because this concept took root and worked and created norms. And I think that's, it just shows really clearly how concepts, they don't just like talk about reality, they also create reality. And in very complicated ways. Yeah, like temperance has a lot of good ideas attached to it, also a lot of really, really problematic ones. And when you start using a concept, you won't ever really be able to know or control which parts of it will catch on. And it's quite a scary thing.
So, yeah, does anybody want to participate in our talk?
Yeah, I like the concept of gaining the impossible. I think it goes well with the concept of failure, you know, of sentiment failure, because if you want to accomplish impossible, well, you will most likely fail. But failure is also can be very creative and beautiful, and even better than the game itself. So yeah, that's what I accomplished. And I have a question for Ahmed about this time-based events. I mean, it sounds great, but how do you? I mean, as we see here, you know, we don't have 100 people in the room. So how do you push people to participate in these time-based events?
We don't. I mean, it's. You mean how do we end up with people actually? I think there is. No, it's an important question because it has to have a history in the space for it actually to happen every time and for it to be reliable. So it needs to act like a tradition and actually learn from what it means. So if people change the way they sit, you try with that setup the next time, and this is, I think, how it goes, and I think it works because it does something. Because with this also we can call art in a way. If we show art, engagement with art can be also something that cultural institutions can provide, and it should. And I chose for this to be what it means to be a curator in a way. It's for this, to create those conditions for engagement more than, hey, beautiful art.
So,
And not to skip Matilda.
Not to let you go get the hook.
Yeah, I mean, temperance sounds great, but one thing is to be a temperance, you know, for yourself, to say I'm not going to drink and so on. But the other thing is how to spread this thing around, you know. I mean, it's not that you can tell school,
you can order it.
you can tell school teachers, you know, tell the
Yeah.
kids to be temperate.
That's the law.
Yeah.
No, that's important, a very difficult question. But I mean, I
It's
think
not
that
really important and difficult questions.
lots of good ones, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I think in general, we are going to start needing to think a lot more about how we talk about ethics at all. I think even like in a wider thing than temperance or virtue ethics, that the idea of having ethical discussions has sort of gotten lost, and that's not weird because it's very, really doesn't work well with the ideas of us being consumers, for example, which I think is really the prevailing identity that, at least in Sweden, but I guess in Europe as a whole, the society is trying to teach us to be. We're taught to be consumers, and even in our political activism or in our political stances, we think of them or tend to start learning to think about them as consumers. And of course, I mean, the basic idea with being a consumer is that you don't really have a responsibility. It's just based on what you want and what you need. So I think that's sort of the route where you need to start trying to think about how can we get back to having the perspective of what we do, how it affects others, other people, and their values, and the more than human world and everything. So just getting away from the very self-centered perspective that we're taught as consumers. And I don't have a very practical approach to how we would do that, but I think it's a discussion that we need to start having if any of these things are really going to start working.
It's good enough for me now. So, yeah.
Does anybody else have a comment or a question or an answer? If not,
An answer would be great.
Yeah, an answer would be great.
Please.
Ahmed is back, so I think that I think that we can continue discussing this maybe in a different setup. But for now, I would like really to thank you all three for helping us figure out whether we can discuss concepts or not, and how, and also for presenting your concepts. I really like them all. I just don't know if we can.
What to do with them?
If the toolbox that I have or that I would like to have can carry them. If I carry them, what to do with them and where. But at least, and I think it's really interesting to try to think out of the box, even if it's a toolbox. Okay. Hvala svima. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.